Hi, I'm Shonali Bassick, and you're watching The Next Big Risk. In a year that was marked by Russia's war in Ukraine, soaring inflation around the world, and torn supply chains, markets see risks everywhere. But these three titans of finance are looking further out for the next risks.
I think that the promise of the American dream has to be defined.
There's almost no discourse about a future pandemic and almost no momentum.
Deglobalization. You're going to see nation states look internally and make sure that they have the ability to support themselves.
But let's start with Joseph Cohen, who is concerned that future generations in the U.S. will not achieve the same financial stability as their parents unless public and private investment rises and Americans are protected by the right agencies to ensure economic growth and to defend the labor force. These are the next big risks.
There are always issues, and for me, there are three in particular that I'm focused on, intermediate and longer term. One has to do with our population. For more than a century, one of the pieces of the secret sauce for the United States growth has been the fact that we've had strong population growth and strong gains in labor force. And I'm concerned about that right now. The second area that I look at has to do with investment. For more than 150 years, the United States has been one of the global leaders in long-term investment, both government investment in infrastructure and also corporate investment in private capital. And what we're seeing is that we have fallen short over the last decade or two, and we need to be looking at that as well. And the third piece that I'm increasingly concerned about has to do with the role of government in the economy. And let me be very careful in how I express this. I believe in markets. I believe that capitalism has worked well in the United States, but not unfettered capitalism. We have benefited from good regulation. It's not always the best, but when we try to protect ourselves as a nation, we tend to do much better. We look at some areas in which that kind of solid, appropriate regulation may now be coming under some risk, and I think that would actually damage long-term economic growth of the United States.
What about the makeup of the United States is creating a more complicated future for labor in the country?
You know, one of the reasons the U.S. economy has outperformed the economy of other developed nations for the last 30 or 40 years has been that we've had faster labor force growth. You know, it's a very simple arithmetic equation. More workers, more GDP. It's not quite that simple, but it boils down to that. And in the United States, we have been very dependent on immigration. By the way, that's not new. This has been a nation of immigrants since its founding. If we're not viewed as welcoming to talent from around the world, we'll have a problem going forward in terms of our long-term growth. When we look at the information from individual companies and industries, we see that there is a labor shortage at all ends. We all know, for example, that right now one of the reasons behind the rise in service inflation has to do with an inadequate number of workers at airports, in hotels, in restaurants, and so on. The area that I spend a lot of my time looking at is the other end as well. Do we have enough new scientists? Do we have enough new engineers? Do we have enough new doctors? And the answer is no, we don't. Keep in mind, you have to also create a pipeline, right? The students who are now K through 12 are the future pipeline of scientists and engineers and doctors, and we're not doing a very good job with them here right now in terms of their skills.
Does this all kind of boil down to the erosion of the promise of the American dream?
I think that the promise of the American dream has to be defined, and that is every generation doing better than the previous generation? Do they have the opportunity to do better than their parents did? And what we have seen over the last 30 years or so, maybe 40, is that median household income in the United States, adjusted for inflation, has not risen. But that is a problem. I think it creates a sense of political discord. It creates a sense of unease among people in the United States. And it is worrisome because we have to think about, how do we get out of this? Well, one way we get out of it is to focus in on the industries that we think can create jobs, that can create good paying jobs, and to protect our workers in that way. The long-term problem is staying ahead of the curve, making sure that the industries that you're supporting are creating jobs, and those jobs are paying well enough so that individuals and households feel that they are moving forward.
You made a comment earlier about how investment in American infrastructure was one of the things that you were worried about. Is this the biggest area of investment that you are concerned about?
Many economists, myself included, believe that the so-called golden era of the 1950s, 1960s economy of the United States was linked to our willingness to invest heavily in the future. And it wasn't just the government, it was also corporations willing to do that. So as a percentage of GDP, we were dramatically above every other nation. We were number one in that category for a century. We no longer are. Part of that is because we are underperforming our own previous commitment to this area, but also other nations have figured it out. In the 21st century, the winning economies and the winning strategies for economic growth, and therefore enhancing the well-being of your people, will depend upon whether you're investing.
The reality is wages have not risen in pace with inflation. And so if you think about the ability for the average American to earn a living, how does that kind of play into this longer-term concern you have about the next 10 years not being as good as the last 10, especially when companies are not going to be able to invest in the way that they used to under a higher interest rate regime?
The strength of economic growth and long-term prosperity, I'm not talking about stock market prosperity, I'm talking about the prosperity of the people in the nation, is very much tied to the health of the middle class, and obviously to whether the wage and income increases for those families are adequate. And that is something that has been a problem now for 40 years in the United States, where the median household income hasn't kept up. So this is not a new problem. I think what has happened is that this rise in inflation has kind of pulled apart the curtains, and now we see much more clearly where these problems are and where the issues are. I, for one, am happy to see that wages are now rising. I'm happy to see that workers have more flexibility in how they want to conduct themselves and so on. I think that's a good start. It's not the end solution. We need to recognize that a 40-year problem is not going to be corrected in 4 months. It's going to take longer.
When you look over the next 5 to 10 years, over a little bit of a longer time horizon, and you think about what's happening in the economy, in markets, in society more largely, what keeps you up at night?
One thing that has, seemed particularly important to me is how we handle future pandemics. We showed with COVID that we were not ready for a global pandemic, and I think we are still not ready for the next one. The really worrying cases is that we have a repeat of what happened with COVID, where we are not prepared at all beforehand, ends up spreading to much of the world, but with a way higher fatality rate, and ends up killing a lot of people. The economy grinds to a halt amid the chaos and lockdowns. Sort of a more extreme version of what we saw during COVID. Is
part of your worry here that the next pandemic would be worse than what we saw in COVID, and a worry that underpins that the systems we have are not prepared for it?
I think it was pretty clear to see in retrospect that we were not ready for COVID. There was no coordination in terms of what responses should be to it. Instead, we saw sort of like completely discoordinated action. If you look at where we are today, we have not started putting any of those processes in place that we should have had last time. If, we got unlucky and there was a future pandemic that was substantially more fatal, you could imagine the same thing playing out, but with a lot more devastation. The biggest problem is that there weren't that many lessons that it seems like we really learned as a society that we are in much the same place we were beforehand. There's almost no discourse about a future pandemic and almost no momentum. We don't seem to have learned really the core lesson of COVID, which was that we were not prepared and that we need to be better prepared.
What kind of strains do you think this is going to put on an economic system in the future?
I think that it played out pretty poorly this time when all was said and done. And I think at the very least, you could see a repeat of that, where not only did we have massive supply chain problems that we're now seeing, in retrospect, we had massive monetary supply increase to try and mask over some of the problems, to try and mask over what would have been probably a devastating economic hit otherwise. As COVID winds down and our economic and monetary countermeasures wind down, it becomes clear we never really averted economic impact from COVID. It's had massive negative impact, right? You can look at runaway inflation, you can look at rising interest rates, a slumping economy, slumping markets. And that was without nearly as many deaths as there could have been, right? You have a future one that does much more damage, and we might not be able to get back to work as a society nearly as quickly or as functionally.
What do you worry about in terms of inequality? Obviously, different societies were impacted differently, both within the U.S. and across the world. So do you worry about the compounding effect when it comes to, the social strata?
Because of the global nature of pandemics, if there's an outbreak in one country, that is going to affect every country. And so not only do you see disproportionate deaths in less well-off countries, but that also makes it really hard for the world to stop the spread of pandemics. And that means that if there are countries that aren't being given first-class access to countermeasures, they will be able to also act as a petri dish for bugs to spread and grow. When all is said and done, we will have spent tens of trillions of dollars as a world trying to contend with the fallout from COVID. That is a really huge expense. And we're still not done with it. It's a little bit sobering to see the scale of impact of that, combined with just like not even solving the problem. And that's with a workforce that is able to mostly go back to work in person. If you have a more deadly strain, there's going to be a lot more worry about getting back to work, and you could see much more protracted productivity declines that sort of tailspin with the tens of trillions of dollars incinerated in the first place.
What about the strain on political systems? You saw kind of the masking issue and the lockdowns becoming a really big contention point politically in many governments across the U.S. and the world. How do you expect that to create a further strain on the system politically?
It put a lot of political and partisan strain on the U.S., as you said, and on many countries. What you really want to do is nip this in the bud so that you stop a pandemic from getting out of control in the first place. Cut it off way closer to the source. That means instead of arguing about masks, we should have been focusing on how can we get in place, good ventilation in indoor buildings so that there is massively less spread of pandemics through them. That would have been a much, much healthier focus for us as a society.
Is there a bipartisan solution, and are there ways that you personally are kind of incorporating this into your own work? I know you've been rising more and more, both as a philanthropist and as a political donor. How are you thinking about this risk in terms of how you work ahead?
This isn't a one party against another party thing in the way that some debates over some specific mitigation techniques ended up being. I have been spending a fair bit of effort and time and capital on trying to advance, pandemic prevention, legislation and policy. A lot of the discourse around, COVID and pandemics in general has, as you sort of, referenced, focused on things like masks. By the time that's the debate, we've already failed at the much more important goal, which is avoiding ending up there in the first place by having countermeasures ready beforehand, by having early detection systems, by having good ventilation in buildings. The goal is to get to a place where outbreaks don't become pandemics in the first place, and where we don't have to shut down, the economy, where people don't have to die, where we don't have to make trade-offs, and hopefully we can, I think, spend tens of billions of dollars today to save tens of trillions of dollars later on.
So, Ken, when you think about the next 5 to 10 years, what worries you most?
I think what we're seeing in front of us right now is I think, deglobalization. You're going to see nation states look internally and make sure that they have the ability to support themselves.
How much of this is a function of the war in Ukraine, and how much of this deglobalization phenomenon started before that?
Well, I think it did start before it. All you have to do is look at Brexit. I mean, the idea for Brexit started, I think it's now 7 or 8 years ago. It didn't happen until 2020, but that's the beginning. I think what you see in the war, Shanali, is, let's just take an exemplary figure in this, Germany. So Germany's strategy up to this point was to outsource their military to the United States, to outsource their financial management to the EU. They outsourced their energy supply to Russia, and they outsourced their end market to China. This was the complete globalization of an economy. And you can see at this point, I think they're in extreme trouble.
So if you think that deglobalization is the next big risk, what's at stake from countries detaching themselves from each other? What really is the problem with that happening?
For a few decades, we were able to outsource to the cheapest labor markets. We were able to rely on each other for goods that really, throughout history, and I do think part of this is going back and reading history, most countries would not outsource items that were very important to their well-being, food being one of them, and I think energy being one that's showing up as to be extremely important. What's going to happen now is I think each society is going to have to think about, did I outsource something that I'm not comfortable with?
How is this even possible to fully become deglobalized when so many nations rely on others? It's not that every nation is rich with oil or rich with nickel or rich with food resources even.
For those of us in the United States, we have a spectacular country filled with the resources we need. Germany has gotten itself in a position where it does not have energy supplies. It turned off its nuclear. It's right at the center and near the war and the ramifications. We're seeing the elements of deglobalization and its cost to ordinary people.
Elaborate on that. You said cost to ordinary people. What are the costs? How else are you seeing it play out?
Throughout history, food has always been a key. And if you look at what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war, I think there's more going on there in terms of supply chains. I'm horrified by the war and the invasion, but I think the motivations and the rationale and what's happening behind it are going to highlight to people. Can I provide the basics? Each country will move to protect their own citizens, and as a result, they might deglobalize ahead of you. There are populations all over the world that we're not aware of, but they want to eat, and they want to be heated in the winter. And by the way, they want access to cheap electricity. And all these things are going through the roof. And to the extent we're feeling the political pain in the U.S., and I believe we'll solve this problem. It might take a couple of years, but it'll work its way out. Not everybody has that choice. Much of the rest of the world has depended on flows of those food goods. I mean, we're talking about part of Africa that is totally reliant on the Ukrainian wheat fields, and Russia was a gigantic exporter of wheat. This is the basic food ingredients that keeps people from rioting, from having insurrection. We saw it again in Sri Lanka over the weekend. You're 9 meals away from having a very unhappy citizenship that's willing to take extraordinary action to get their families safe. There are, 7 billion people in the world. I'd say 1 billion of them, let's say roughly, are in Western Europe and the U.S. And we've set in course policies that are very much focused to a society that has reached middle class. I'm not saying everybody, but the vast amount of society is very interested in things that 6 billion people, 2 billion in sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Asia, are still trying to reach middle class. And if we raise their energy costs dramatically, I don't think they're going to be, they're not going to be happy about that. And I think the Arab Spring fundamentally started over food prices. And their basic instinct and need is to feed, heat, clothe, and take care of their family.
So what are the forces that are reversing decades of globalization?
Well, it might be just the safety of these supply chains, and possibly the actions by Russia are a highlight to that. But again, go back to Brexit, a decision by the UK people in a vote to take back some of their outsourcing. They had outsourced their labor force to Central Europe, and they had started to make a decision to pull it back for whatever reasons. They didn't like outsourcing, again, outsourcing your financial management to the EU and the ECB.
You mentioned the outsourcing of financial assets. On one hand, I'm wondering what impact do the sanctions have?
Some of our policy moves here are going to have very long-term ramifications. In this environment, we've frozen the bank reserves of Russian bank reserves. And if you don't think that every single, maybe not every single, but a substantial number of finance ministers around the world have to rethink, well, are their assets secure? I've had many people ask me, what do I do with my assets in China? What do I do with my assets in Hong Kong? There's a lot of Western investment in Hong Kong residual. What happens if we end up in a similar disagreement or conflict? Are those assets subject to immediate abandonment? These are questions everybody's going to ask, whether they talk about them a lot or not. They're going to be asked. I'm not saying we'll go to 100% investment in your own country, but boy, the risk premium has significantly gone up.
I mean, is this just a giant politicization of assets around the world as you see it, given that now governments are getting involved in a much more deep way in terms of the resources that they own, oversee, and trade?
There were several companies who've had to abandon assets immediately because of a conflict. So now you have to anticipate, where in the world might we not like the activities of a future regime? And you could come up with a long list of where you might be uncomfortable. And you have to truly change your risk profile there. So we're in the middle of seeing a very effective use of the weaponization of resources. Now, not everybody can weaponize their resources because they don't have enough resources.
So to the extent that this is the biggest risk you see on the horizon over the medium to long term, what about it really keeps you up at night?
There is a possibility, I think this leads to revolution in populations that do not have control over their food and energy. And in a world that we live in, like it or not, the change in the world toward cheap energy, mobilization, cars, oil and gas is used for clothing, it's used for a significant amount of products. And again, food is food. And I get concerned as to what can happen in these countries if oil and gas does get to be $200 a barrel, and if the supply, the actual food supply, gets disintermediated. I think you could have ramifications we haven't seen. Now, I'm pretty bullish on the world, so I think people figure these things out. But I think the quicker the world focuses on it and admits that they have to supply and be independent of global trade in the best way they can, the better for their populations.